As she cleaned the Barrett 50, the SEAL commander noticed her 3,247-meter kill record. The light inside the armory was dim, a mix of dust and dusk that softened everything it touched except her precision. The cloth in her hand moved slowly, gliding across the cold metal of the Barrett 50 like a whisper. The sound was subtle, a low scrape, a rhythm known only to those who had spent too many nights listening to silence because silence was safer than sleep. She didn't hurry. The ritual mattered more than the rifle. Each pass of the cloth across the barrel felt like a confession, each motion a way of remembering without words. The weapon lay across the table like a sleeping animal, heavy, patient, coiled in potential. Most soldiers handled rifles as tools. She handled hers like truth. Every inch of steel had carried her heartbeat through moments that blurred the line between control and collapse. And yet she cleaned it gently, almost tenderly, because care was the only mercy she still believed in. The door behind her opened with the hiss of hydraulics. She didn't turn. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, military. She already knew who it was. There were only a few people on this base who walked with weight and silence at once. The SEAL commander stopped a few feet behind her. He watched her hands move, left, right, wipe, rotate, inspect. There was something unsettling about the steadiness in her motion. Soldiers came back from war zones trembling. She came back quieter, which was worse. He waited for her to acknowledge him, but she didn't. Finally, he said, "You clean that rifle like it's alive." Without looking up, she replied, "It is." Her voice was calm even, the kind that carried across chaos without effort. It wasn't arrogance, it was precision made audible. He moved closer, the smell of gun oil thick in the air. "I've seen operators who can strip and reassemble a Barrett blindfolded, but I've never seen anyone clean it like they're praying." She paused, her hand hovering over the bolt. "Prayer is asking for forgiveness. This is remembering," the words lingered. He didn't interrupt. Her tone was soft, but it carried weight. There was no boast in her, no decoration on her uniform, just the faint shimmer of something that could have been grief or discipline. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. He leaned against the steel counter beside her, crossing his arms. "You've been back from the valley 2 weeks, haven't said a word in debrief. The brass is calling you a ghost." She placed the bolt gently beside the receiver. "Ghosts don't clean their weapons." He almost smiled, but something in her eyes kept him from it. She looked down the length of the barrel as if searching for a reflection she could recognize. That's when his eyes fell on the number scratched faintly into the metal tag on the bench. 3,247 meters. He frowned. "That's your confirmed distance?" She nodded once, still not looking at him. 3 targets. "On bullet," he exhaled quietly. "That's beyond record range." "That's luck?" She finished for him, eyes lifting finally. They were pale, focused, and so devoid of vanity that it unsettled him. No, it was wind, breath, and math. Nothing divine about it. He studied her face in the silence that followed. She was young, too young for the weight in her eyes. The kind of youth that had been burned out rather than lived out. "You were covering Echo Squad, right? Sangin Valley?" She nodded again, setting the rifle down carefully. "They didn't come back." "I know," he said softly. "I read the report. Your shot saved the recon unit pinned on the ridge. 3 tangos down, extraction successful." She resumed cleaning the magazine, her movement slower now. Reports always end with extraction successful. They never mention what got extracted. He wanted to ask what she meant, but he didn't need to. He had led enough missions to recognize that look, the one soldiers carried when they returned alive, but unfinished. After a long pause, he asked, "How long did you wait for the shot?" 6 hours, she said. Wind was wrong. Temperature dropped. I could feel the air change every minute. It was like trying to breathe through a heartbeat. And when it was right, I stopped breathing. He studied her as she reassembled the rifle piece by piece, every click precise, every movement unbroken. The weapon came back together the way some people folded letters they could never send, perfectly, but with pain hidden in the edges. When she finished, she stood and wiped her hands on the cloth. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light. The commander asked quietly, "Do you ever think about it?" Her answer was immediate, always, but not the way people imagine. "I don't see faces. I see distances, wind speed, scope alignment, the space between heartbeat and bullet. That's where I live now, between." He nodded slowly, unsure if she was confessing or teaching him something he didn't want to learn. You don't talk much about yourself. There's not much to say. You could have left, he said. After that mission, nobody would have blamed you. She met his eyes steady. Leaving doesn't make the sound stop. He exhaled, the truth of that sentence settling between them like dust. You remind me of something I heard once. That snipers don't aim to kill. They aim to end motion. She picked up the rifle and rested it across her shoulder. Maybe. Or maybe we just aim to control what chaos refuses to. As she turned toward the doorway, he asked, "Do you miss it? The quiet before the shot?" She stopped, one hand on the frame, the light catching the faint scar along her jawline. "Every day," she said. "It's the only time the world made sense." He watched her walk out into the fading sunlight. The echo of her boots on concrete lingered long after she was gone. For a moment, he glanced down at the etched number again, 3247, and wondered if anyone could live that far from peace and still come back whole. Outside, the air carried the faint thrum of helicopter blades in the distance. Somewhere beyond the base, the next operation was already unfolding, and though he didn't say it aloud, he knew he'd be calling her name before it was over. Because there were soldiers who could shoot, and then there were those who could see. And she saw farther than anyone. The desert was breathing again. That's what she always called it. The slow pulse of heat and silence that came alive at dawn, expanding through the air until even the rocks seemed to sigh. The base was quiet except for the occasional metallic groan of a gate shifting in the wind. The war for a few hours felt paused, but she knew better. War never paused. It only changed rhythm. She sat alone outside the barracks, Barrett resting across her knees. Her hand moved along the barrel, tracing each tiny scratch she already knew by memory. Each one had a story, and though she never told them aloud, she could feel them. Some were from dust storms, some from shrapnel, one from the moment she had dropped the rifle while pulling a body from a collapsed ridge. It wasn't the weapon she was attached to. It was the silence it carried. Inside the mess hall, laughter echoed briefly, the sound of soldiers pretending not to feel the emptiness pressing at their ribs. She didn't join them. People were always louder after missions that went right, as if noise could drown the guilt of surviving. She had learned that the quieter she stayed, the longer she could hold her own sanity. The SEAL commander found her there, exactly where he expected her to be. He didn't announce himself this time. He just sat down beside her, resting his arms on his knees. The two of them watched the horizon as the sun began its slow rise over the dunes. She could feel him studying her from the corner of his eye. Most men tried to read her like a mystery that could be solved if they stared long enough. They never understood that she wasn't hiding anything. Some people just had nothing left to confess. The silence stretched, comfortable and fragile at the same time. Eventually, he said, "You know, there are people in DC arguing over who gets to claim your shot. The brass, the unit, the branch. They want to turn you into a headline?" She didn't look at him. "Headlines fade. Distances don't," he smiled faintly. "You're the only sniper I've met who talks like a philosopher." Maybe philosophers just had better spotters. He laughed under his breath. But she didn't. The horizon shifted in the light, and for a moment she could see heat rising like ghosts from the sand. She whispered more to herself than to him. The world always wants stories about victories. They never want to talk about what's left behind them. He leaned back slightly. "You ever tell anyone how it felt? That day in Sungin?" Her fingers stopped moving. She stared at the rifle. "You can't describe something that isn't one feeling. It's everything at once. Fear, focus, hunger, stillness. You want to be God for 1 second, then you remember that gods don't bleed." He looked at her closely, but she wasn't there anymore. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far away, beyond the sand, beyond the base, beyond time itself. "When I took that shot," she continued, "I remember thinking how far 3,000 meters really is. You don't see faces at that distance. You don't even see men. You see motion, heat, geometry, and then nothing. No sound, no celebration. Just quiet. A quiet so deep you wonder if the world is still turning." She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the desert air. "That's when I realized something. People think snipers pull triggers. We don't. We hold time. For a moment, everything stops because we decide it does." The commander didn't speak. He couldn't. Her words carried the weight of truth too heavy for language. Finally, he asked softly, "What do you do when time starts again?" Her reply came slowly. "You clean the Barrett." The wind shifted, carrying grains of sand across their boots. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter stirred, its blades chopping the air like an unwanted thought. The commander looked at her again. "We've got an assignment coming up. Something different. We'll need overwatch on a convoy through Korangal Pass. Tight terrain, limited visibility. You'd be covering from 600 meters out. Too close for comfort." She finally turned her head toward him. "And you're asking if I can do it?" He shook his head. "I know you can. I'm asking if you should." She didn't blink. "It doesn't matter what I should do. War doesn't care about should." Her words stung because they were true. The line between choice and duty had blurred long ago. He nodded slowly, resigned. "You leave at 400. When he walked away, she stayed there, watching the sun climb higher. The heat shimmered across the sand, making the horizon look alive. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, a photo. Faded, creased, almost colorless. A group of faces, smiling, squinting in bright light. Her old team. Echo Squad. She traced one of the faces with her thumb. "Still watching," she whispered. Then she folded the photo back into her pocket and stood. That night, the camp was silent again. Soldiers slept in broken rhythms, engines murmured, radios crackled softly in the distance. She sat at her bunk cleaning the Barrett one more time. Her movements were automatic, but her mind was far away. She remembered the shot, not the bullet, not the impact, but the space between. The pause when time surrendered to her finger. The moment she stopped breathing and became stillness itself. She wrote in her notebook, her handwriting sharp and deliberate. "The world always wants noise. But some of us were born to guard the silence." Before sleeping, she lined the Barrett beside her bed. It gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its long barrel reflecting her face in broken fragments. She thought of the number, 3247, and how it was supposed to mean something. To her, it meant distance from herself. At 0400, she was already awake. The convoy briefing was short. Coordinates, elevation, weather. She memorized everything without writing it down. Numbers anchored her more than sleep ever could. As they moved out into the cold pre-dawn, the commander walked beside her. The desert air was crisp, thin. "You ever wonder how long you'll keep doing this?" he asked. She adjusted the rifle strap across her shoulder. "Until I stop seeing clearly. And what happens when you stop?" "I won't need to aim anymore." He didn't ask what that meant. Some truths were safer unspoken. By sunrise, they reached the overlook. The terrain was brutal, cliffs layered like scars, valleys narrow and twisting. She set up her position without hesitation, crawling into the dirt, steadying the bipod, aligning the scope. She moved like someone who had done this long before orders were necessary. The commander crouched beside her. "Wind, southwest. 2 knots. Visibility? 700 meters. Shadows will move fast after dawn." He nodded, checked his watch, then stepped back. "We'll move on your call." She didn't answer. Her eye was already in the scope, her breath slowing. Through the glass, the world condensed into clarity. The scope erased chaos. It gave her order, edges, focus. She saw the convoy below, trucks lined like veins of steel, men moving small and fragile across the terrain. Everything distant, everything measured. And for a moment, she felt that silence again, the one that lived between heartbeat and bullet, between purpose and memory. It was the same silence that had followed her since Sengin, the same one she both feared and longed for. When the first crack of enemy fire echoed through the valley, she didn't flinch. She adjusted for wind, exhaled, and let her body disappear into the rifle. The Barrett spoke once. Then the world went quiet. The shot echoed through the valley and then vanished as if the mountains themselves had swallowed it. She held her breath for another 3 seconds before allowing air back into her lungs. In those seconds, she could always tell whether she had missed. This time, she knew she hadn't. The recoil had whispered the answer through her shoulder, a vibration she could feel in her bones. Somewhere down in the dust, a rifle had fallen silent. The convoy below hesitated. Soldiers ducked for cover, shouting into radios, scanning the ridgelines. She adjusted her scope, shifting from one patch of movement to another. The world inside the lens was smaller but clearer. Everything that mattered lived inside that narrow circle of glass. She followed the rhythm of breath and motion. 2 heartbeats, 1 exhale, stillness. Another shot, another ripple through the silence. When the last echo faded, she withdrew from the scope. The desert heat was rising, waves of distortion bending the air. The commander's voice came through the comms, rough and controlled. "Convoy secure. 2 contacts down." "Good eyes." She didn't answer. Words after a shot always felt wrong, like noise inside a church. She wiped a line of sweat from her temple and stared at the horizon where the light was already blinding. The team began to move again. Engines coughed, tires ground against gravel, dust spiraled upward. From her position on the ridge, she could see everything. The trail of metal winding through sand, the small human figures lost inside the scale of landscape. The scope made distance manageable. Naked eyes made it unbearable. The commander climbed up to her position 20 minutes later. His steps were heavy from the climb, his breath short. He crouched beside her, scanning the valley through binoculars. "You bought us another hour," he said. "Maybe more." She nodded faintly, still watching the empty stretch of road. "Hours don't last long out here." He lowered the binoculars. "You could take the rest of the day to breathe. We'll hold the line. I'm breathing now." He studied her profile, the set of her jaw, the stillness that looked almost unnatural. "Do you ever get used to it?" He asked. "Silence?" "The space after the shot." She thought for a long time. "You don't get used to it. You learn to live in it." He didn't press. There was a fragility to her calm that he had learned not to touch. Instead, he watched the light change across the sand. The morning was turning gold, and for a fleeting second, the battlefield looked almost beautiful. That contrast, beauty in ruin, always unnerved him. They descended together when the convoy reached the next checkpoint. The camp there was nothing more than a cluster of canvas and dust, but it felt like a city compared to the silence of the ridge. She moved through it quietly, unnoticed except for the few soldiers who whispered her name like a myth. Inside a small tent, she dismantled the Barrett again. Cleaning after each shot had become her ritual. She aligned every piece with obsessive precision: the bolt, the scope, the magazine spring. The commander watched from the entrance. "You treat that rifle like it's the only thing keeping you alive," he said. "It is." He stepped closer. "You know there are medics on base who say the same about morphine." She looked up at him. "We all have our medicine." He wanted to argue, but didn't. Instead, he watched her hands, the way she polished the barrel until it caught the faintest glimmer of light. "You ever think about what you'll do when this ends?" She paused, her eyes fixed on the reflection of the tent light across the steel. "I don't think about things that don't end." That night, the wind shifted again. The air smelled of storm, though the sky remained clear. She sat outside her tent, notebook balanced on her knee. Her handwriting was small, deliberate. "Silence is not peace. It's only the space where truth can breathe." She underlined the sentence twice before closing the notebook. The commander joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to her and sat down. "You write often?" "Enough to remember." "What about?" "Things that shouldn't disappear." He nodded, sipping his coffee. "Like that number of yours. 3,247 meters. They'll carve it into some record book one day." She stared into the cup. "Let them carve it into the wind. It'll fade faster," he smiled faintly. "You don't like being remembered?" "Not for distance. Distance isn't what matters. What matters is what's left of you when you come back from it." The night deepened around them. The desert was alive with invisible noise. Whispers of sand moving, distant engines, the hum of generators. He found himself speaking before thinking. "You ever afraid of missing?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid of hitting." He looked at her, uncertain. "Why?" "Because every shot that lands means someone didn't come back from it." "Accuracy isn't pride, Commander." "It's debt." He said nothing after that. The wind picked up, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain. She finished her coffee and stood, brushing sand from her pants. "We leave before dawn?" 0500, he said. "I'll be ready." She walked away toward her tent. The canvas fluttered behind her, the shadows swallowing her whole. The commander watched her go, that same unease growing in his chest. There was something about her that felt like the storm itself. Quiet before it breaks. Beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Inside her tent, she unrolled her sleeping bag and lay down, eyes open, watching the fabric ripple in the wind. She didn't sleep. She rarely did. Instead, she counted breaths until the world outside blurred into the sound she trusted most, the rhythm of silence between heartbeats. When dawn returned, she was already awake. She cleaned the rifle again, each motion precise, deliberate. She thought about the distance she had held the day before, about how the bullet had flown through layers of air, dust, light, and time. The shot existed for less than a second, yet its echo might last forever in someone else's story. Before she joined the team, she opened her notebook again and wrote a single line. "The closer I aim, the farther I drift." She closed it carefully and tucked it back into her pocket. The mission brief was short. A supply route north, possible ambush sites along the ridges. Standard words for an unstandard war. The commander gave orders, the soldiers checked their gear, the engines roared to life. When he looked up at her across the vehicles, she was already climbing into the back seat, the Barrett across her lap, her expression unreadable. As the convoy rolled forward into the morning light, she felt that familiar calm settle over her, the strange quiet that came before purpose. Outside, the wind carried the scent of metal and dust. Inside her, the world was perfectly still. She thought again about distance, about the numbers that defined her. 3,247 meters. The world measured her by that line, but she knew better. The real distance wasn't between her and the target. It was between who she had been and who she had become each time she pulled the trigger. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon glowing like a promise it would never keep. She rested her hand on the rifle and closed her eyes for just a moment. In that instant, she wasn't a soldier, or a sniper, or a name written in any file. She was simply a breath suspended in time, waiting for the next silence to begin. The road north was nothing but dust and memory. The convoy crawled through the valley like a line of old scars reopened by heat. Every mile was a gamble between silence and ambush. She rode in the last vehicle, her rifle resting across her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon through the narrow window slit. The Barrett was heavy, but its weight grounded her. She trusted it more than she trusted people. Machines didn't lie. They simply obeyed. The commander rode in the lead Humvee. His voice occasionally broke through the radio static. Short, measured, the kind of calm that only came from exhaustion disguised as control. She listened without listening. Orders were just noise until they became necessity. By noon, the sun had turned the world into glass. Heat shimmered over the road, bending light until the landscape seemed to breathe. The team halted under a rock overhang to check maps and drink from canteens that tasted of metal and dust. She stepped out, scanning the ridgelines. Her instincts were old, older than orders. Something in the silence bothered her. It wasn't quiet enough. The commander walked toward her, shielding his eyes. "You see something?" She didn't answer right away. She tilted her head slightly, listening. The wind was wrong, too steady, too rehearsed. "No birds," she said finally. He frowned. "You think?" Her voice cut softly through his. "I know." Before he could speak again, the first shot hit the ground near the convoy. Then another. The sound was sharp, flat, foreign, too distant to see, too close to escape. Soldiers dove for cover, radios burst into static, engines roared back to life. She dropped to her knee, scanning the ridge through her scope. The world narrowed instantly into numbers, distance, elevation, wind, there, a shimmer on the ridge, the faint glint of glass against stone. She adjusted 0.5 millimeter, exhaled, and fired. The Barrett roared, thunder rolling down the valley. The glint vanished. She didn't move for a long moment, waiting, watching. The silence that followed was thicker than sound. Finally, she spoke into the comms, her voice cold and steady. "One down. Top ridge. They'll reposition?" The commander's voice came back, calm but taut. "Copy, move east. Cover flank." She slung the Barrett across her shoulder and sprinted toward the outcropping, dust rising with each step. The weapon was almost her height, but she carried it as if it were part of her. When she reached higher ground, she lay flat, pressed the scope to her eye, and searched for the second shooter. Minutes passed. Nothing but wind and echo. Then she saw it, a shadow shifting behind a rock formation. She adjusted her aim, timing the breath between gusts. She could feel her pulse slowing, everything outside her fading. The world became just light, distance, and breath. She fired again. The silence that followed felt endless. Then the commander's voice cut through. "Both down. Convoy clear," she exhaled, her body relaxing by fractions. Around her, dust began to settle. The smell of gunpowder clung to her skin, mingling with sweat and sand. She stayed prone, eyes still on the ridge, unwilling to trust the quiet just yet. When the commander reached her position, he crouched beside her, breathing heavily. "2 snipers. Good eyes. They were good too," she said softly. "Better than most." He followed her gaze to the ridge. "How'd you know?" Silence always gives itself away. You just have to know how to listen. He looked at her for a long moment, not with admiration but with a kind of respect that carried sorrow in it. You've been doing this too long. She didn't reply. She began to break down the Barrett instead, sliding the bolt free, wiping the barrel with the same slow reverence she always did. The commander sat beside her, rubbing dust from his face. You ever wonder what happens to the ones we don't see? Someone else sees them, she said. That's how the circle keeps turning. That night, the campfire flickered low between them. The convoy had stopped near an old outpost. Half walls, rusted wire, the ghost of a radio tower. They ate in silence. The stars above looked unreal, scattered like broken glass across the dark. The commander finally spoke. You ever think you'll stop? She stared at the fire, its reflection dancing in her eyes. Stopping doesn't mean peace. It just means someone else pulls the trigger. He nodded slowly. You sound like you've already made peace with never finding it. Peace isn't found, she said. It's remembered. Usually too late. She set her empty tin aside and pulled her notebook from her pocket. Her handwriting, even under firelight, was neat. Every bullet has two names, the one who sends it and the one who remembers it. She paused, then wrote underneath, I still remember all of them. The commander watched her write, then asked, Why do you keep that? So I don't become what I fight. He leaned back, staring at the stars. Does it work? Not always. The night grew colder. The desert wind carried distant sounds, metal creaking, something alive moving far off, maybe wind, maybe memory. She lay back on the sand, the Barrett beside her, its black silhouette against the starlight like a cross carved into the earth. She closed her eyes, but her mind didn't rest. It drifted back to Sangin Valley, the shot, the silence, the stillness after. She could still see the moment through the scope, the strange beauty of it, the tragedy of perfection. She had never aimed to make a record. She had only aimed to make it stop. When she opened her eyes again, dawn was just beginning to break, painting the desert in shades of gold and ash. The commander was already awake, studying the horizon through binoculars. Sleep? He asked. No. Dreams? No, he nodded. Same. They packed their gear in silence. When the engines roared again, she climbed into her seat, the Barrett resting across her knees. The convoy rolled forward into another day, another stretch of distance, another silence waiting to be broken. Inside the Humvee, she watched the sand shift in the wind and thought about how war was built on repetition. Clean, aim, fire, clean again. The only thing that ever changed was the name of the place and the faces of the dead. She turned her gaze toward the commander in the front seat. He was studying a map, his face drawn but focused. There was something in his expression that told her he understood too. That quiet understanding between those who had looked too long into distance and found themselves lost inside it. When they stopped again that evening, she didn't clean the Barrett immediately. She sat on a rock instead, staring at her reflection in the rifle's scope. For the first time in years, she didn't recognize the eyes looking back. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain again. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, thunder rolled softly. She whispered to the empty air, "One more day." Then quieter still. One more distance. The rain came without thunder. It arrived quietly, as though the desert had been waiting centuries for it. Fat drops fell onto the dust and vanished before leaving puddles, evaporating into the air as steam. She sat beneath a torn canvas awning, the Barrett resting across her lap, a dark silhouette against the gray. The storm's scent, iron, sand, and memory filled her lungs. It reminded her of the day after the Sangin shot, when the valley had been soaked in the same metallic perfume of rain and blood. The others took shelter inside their vehicles, laughter echoing faintly through the static of the radios. Soldiers always laughed when they could. It was their rebellion against the inevitable. She didn't join them. She watched the rain fall, her mind tracing the invisible line between each drop and the silence that followed it. The SEAL commander approached quietly, his jacket soaked through. He stopped beside her, scanning the horizon. "You're the only one who doesn't run from the rain," he said. She didn't turn. Rain is the only sound that doesn't accuse. He frowned slightly, unsure if it was philosophy or confession. "We move at first light," he said after a pause. "Intel says there's an abandoned outpost 10 clicks north. Satellite picked up possible movement inside. Could be nothing, could be a staging area." She nodded once, eyes still on the horizon. Then we'll see, he hesitated. You ever get tired of we'll see? I got tired of certainty first. He left her alone after that, the sound of his boots fading into the hiss of rainfall. When the storm passed, the world smelled new, but looked the same. Mud replaced dust, but Death didn't care about the weather. She cleaned the Barrett slowly, her hands methodical. Drops of water slid off the metal like tears she no longer had. That night, she wrote by flashlight. Rain is mercy pretending to be memory. She paused, then added beneath it, every drop falls to the same earth, but not every drop leaves a mark. When dawn came, the convoy rolled out. The world was washed of color, the desert pale and bruised under a curtain of mist. The air was heavy, visibility poor, perfect conditions for ghosts. They reached the outpost by noon. The structure was little more than ruin, a skeleton of concrete and wire half buried in sand. The silence around it was unnatural. No birds, no wind, no echo. She stepped out first, rifle in hand, scanning. The commander motioned for 2 men to flank the entrance while she climbed a nearby dune to cover. Through the scope, the world sharpened into clarity. She could see the cracks in the walls, the jagged metal of the roof, the faint shimmer of heat escaping from a vent. There's movement inside, she said softly into the radio. 1, maybe 2. The commander's voice came back, clipped and calm. Copy that. Hold position. Minutes stretched into hours, disguised as seconds. The waiting was worse than the fight. Stillness always carried more weight than chaos. Then, from the corner of her scope, a shadow shifted. She adjusted, breath slowing, finger tightening on the trigger. A man stepped into the open, unarmed, hands raised. Dust covered his uniform, his eyes hollow. Prisoner? Survivor? The commander's voice crackled through her earpiece. Hold fire. We'll check him. She watched as 2 soldiers approached. The man spoke quickly, gestures frantic, language indistinct. Then, in a blink, he dropped to his knees and the ground exploded beneath him. The shockwave threw her back, sand and debris filling the air. The sound hit seconds later, a roar that seemed to tear the world in half. When she lifted her head, smoke was already rising. The outpost was gone. The men were gone. The commander's voice came through, hoarse, shouting through the static. Ambush! Ambush! East Ridge! She rolled to position, eyes finding movement through the smoke. Figures on the ridge, rifles flashing. She didn't think. She aligned, exhaled, fired. The Barrett roared and 1 figure dropped. Another. But there were too many, and her angle was compromised. Through the haze, she saw the commander dragging one of the injured men toward cover. Instinct overrode thought. She grabbed her pack, sprinted down the dune, and slid into the wreckage. Bullets ripped through the air, chipping stone, biting sand. She dropped beside him, blood streaking his sleeve. You shouldn't have come down here, he said through clenched teeth. She reloaded, eyes scanning the ridge. Neither should they. She fired again, and the world narrowed to rhythm. Breath, sight, trigger, silence. Each shot was a small erasure of chaos. The ridge began to quiet. The last of the attackers scattered into the dust. When it was over, the air was thick with smoke and disbelief. The outpost was gone, the convoy crippled, 3 men down. The commander sat against a slab of concrete, pressing a bandage to his arm. She crouched beside him, wiping soot from her face. They used the survivor as bait, he said, voice raw. They knew we'd check. They knew we still believed in mercy, she said. That's their weapon. He looked at her, something sharp in his gaze. And what's yours? She didn't hesitate. Memory. That night the camp was silent again. Too silent. The remaining men worked without words, setting up new perimeter lights, burning the wreckage that couldn't be salvaged. Firelight painted the sand in shades of red. She sat apart, cleaning the Barrett once more. The smell of oil and smoke mingled, thick and intoxicating. Her hands moved by memory, automatic. Across from her, the commander watched her through the flicker of flame. You saved us again, he said quietly. She didn't look up. Not all of you, he didn't argue. They both knew survival was a fraction, never a whole. Later, when everyone else slept, she opened her notebook. The page trembled slightly under her hand. Mercy gets you killed, but forgetting makes you less than alive. She paused, then wrote beneath it, so I choose to remember, even when it hurts. She closed the book and set it beside her rifle. The fire had burned low, glowing embers reflected in the barrel like fading stars. In the distance, thunder rolled again, not from the sky but from artillery far beyond the dunes. The war was still breathing, she whispered to the empty air. You're still here. It wasn't clear if she meant the commander, the ghosts, or the silence itself. The morning after the ambush arrived without color. The desert was gray, sky and sand indistinguishable, as if the world itself hadn't yet decided whether to keep existing. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the outpost, thin and fragile, vanishing as soon as it rose. The wind carried the faint scent of burning metal and wet dust, a smell she had long ago learned to call aftermath. She sat alone beside what was left of the perimeter wall, the Barrett resting across her knees. Her hands moved automatically, cleaning, oiling, aligning, each motion precise, ritualistic. There was blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers. She hadn't bothered to wash it off. Some stains, she'd learned, didn't want to leave. The commander stood a few meters away, speaking quietly with one of the medics. His left arm was wrapped in fresh gauze, the white already blotched with red. He looked older than he had the day before. Not in years, but in weight. When he finally approached her, she didn't look up. How bad? She asked. 3 dead, he said. 5 injured. 1 gone missing in the blast. Her cloth froze mid-wipe. Gone? He nodded. We searched the perimeter twice. Nothing. She set the rifle down, her voice even but heavy. You think they took him? I think they wanted to. She nodded once. Then they'll use him. The same way they used the last one. Silence stretched between them, taut and sharp. The wind picked up, scattering ash across the sand. The commander crouched beside her. You should rest. We'll move when the extraction team arrives. I'm fine. You're not. Her eyes flicked toward him, calm but unyielding. Fine isn't the same as whole. You should know that by now. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he sat beside her, watching her hands work. Every motion was deliberate, like a heartbeat she controlled because it was the only thing left she could. After a while, he said quietly, When we get back to base, I'll have to file another report. They'll want every detail. She kept her gaze on the rifle. And what will you tell them? The truth. They don't want the truth. They want the version that hurts less. He sighed, rubbing his temple. You ever get tired of being right? No, she said softly. Just tired. The day dragged on. The sun returned, cruel and bright, bleaching everything it touched. The extraction helicopters came in the late afternoon, blades chopping the air into violence. The wind from their arrival lifted dust and debris, turning the desert into a storm of memory. She boarded the chopper last, the Barrett slung across her shoulder. As the rotors screamed overhead, she glanced back once at the blackened ruins of the outpost. Smoke twisted upward like a ghost still refusing to leave. The base was different when they returned. Quieter. Eyes followed her as she walked through the hangar, but no one spoke. Word of the ambush had already spread. To some, she was the reason anyone had survived. To others, she was the reminder that too many hadn't. That night, she sat alone in the armory again. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her, painting everything in sterile white. The Barrett lay disassembled before her, each piece gleaming under the light. She cleaned slowly, deliberately, the cloth moving in perfect rhythm. The commander entered without knocking. His uniform was still dusty, his bandaged arm hanging stiffly at his side. He watched her for a moment, then said, You ever stop? Her eyes stayed on the rifle. Stopping feels like dying. You ever wonder what's left when this ends? She paused, the cloth stilling mid-motion. If it ends, he leaned against the counter studying her. You remind me of a story one of my instructors told. He said some soldiers come home and the war stays behind. Others come home, but the war follows them. And a few never come home at all, even when they do. She glanced up at him. Which one are you? I haven't decided. She reassembled the Barrett, sliding the bolt in place with a soft click. I stopped deciding a long time ago. For a while, they said nothing. The hum of the light filled the silence, the sound of the outside world muffled by thick concrete walls. Finally, he said, They want you in the next mission. Of course they do. High priority. Prisoner recovery. Her eyes lifted sharply. The missing man, he nodded. Satellite picked up movement east of the valley. Small encampment. If he's alive, that's where they'll keep him. She stood, slinging the rifle across her back. When do we leave? Tomorrow at dawn. We're going in light. 4 men. No backup. She looked at him for a long time. You already know what that means. He nodded. Yeah, it means someone might not come back. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. Then make sure it's not him. The next morning came too soon. The desert was cold, the kind of cold that bites the bone and whispers of death. She sat at the edge of the runway, waiting, the Barrett resting beside her like an old friend. The commander joined her, his expression unreadable. You ever think about the number? He asked suddenly. She frowned slightly. What number? 3,247. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon. It's just a measurement. Of what? Of distance. Of silence. Of what it costs to survive. He nodded slowly. Then maybe this time we shorten it. She said nothing. She simply picked up the rifle and followed him toward the helicopter. As the rotors spun and the ground fell away, she felt that familiar stillness settle over her again, the space between noise and purpose, between fear and focus. Below them, the desert stretched endless and ancient. Above them, the sky waited like an unanswered question. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a line she had written once, but never said aloud. If silence is mercy, then I am already forgiven. The helicopter tilted east, carrying them toward another ridge, another mission, another measure of distance. The wind rushed through the cabin, loud enough to drown the heartbeat she was no longer sure belonged to her. The helicopter flew low over the desert, slicing through dawn like a blade through fog. The horizon was bleeding light, streaks of red and gold merging into dust. She sat in the rear seat, the Barrett across her knees, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. The hum of the rotors filled the air, but inside her head there was only silence, the kind that comes before choice, or after loss. The commander sat opposite her, helmet off, his expression unreadable. He checked his rifle mechanically, though both of them knew she was the real weapon. Between them lay a folded map, its creases worn thin from fingers and worry. Outpost Bravo Echo, he said, shouting over the roar. Coordinates matched the last transmission. We move in from the West Ridge, minimal light, minimal sound. You'll take overwatch at 600 meters, she nodded once. Hostile count? Unknown. Satellite picked up 5 heat signatures, possibly more underground. We get in, we get the prisoner, we get out, fast. She didn't answer. Her mind was already running numbers, wind, elevation, the way the light would shift once the sun broke the ridge. War had rhythms, and she had learned to listen to them better than she listened to her own heartbeat. As the chopper banked east, the world unfolded beneath them, a vast, endless expanse of ridges and scars. It looked peaceful from above, like a graveyard pretending to be landscape. The commander tapped her shoulder. We're 3 clicks out. Time to wake up the ghosts. She adjusted her headset, the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. They never sleep. The pilot's voice cut through the comms. 2 minutes to drop. Wind steady. No movement detected. She looked down at the Barrett, the faint scratches on its surface catching the light. The weapon had seen more sunrises than she had smiles. She remembered something the commander had said once. Every shot is a choice. She wondered if that was still true. The helicopter descended into a shallow valley. Dust rose in swirling patterns around them, the color of bone. As the skids touched the ground, she leapt out first, boots sinking slightly into the sand. The air was cold, sharp. She crouched low, scanning the horizon, every sense awake. The others followed, the commander and 3 men from his unit, faces half hidden by goggles and shadow. They moved without words, each step rehearsed, each breath measured. She felt the shift in the wind immediately. East to west. Good for her angle. They split at the ridge. She climbed higher, finding her position behind a rock outcrop. From here, she could see the entire compound below, a cluster of ruined buildings surrounded by rusted wire. The sand around it was disturbed, tracks leading inward but not out. Through her scope, the world shrank into clarity. She could see movement. 3 figures near a tent, 1 standing guard, 2 dragging something heavy. She zoomed closer. A body. Still breathing. The missing man. Visual confirmed, she whispered into the comms. He's alive. But not for long. The commander's voice came back, low and steady. Copy that. Hold position. Wait for signal. She adjusted her scope, aligning crosshairs with the guard's chest. Distance 608 meters. Wind 2 knots left. Breath steady. Time bent again, folding itself into the stillness she knew too well. When the commander's signal came, 3 short clicks on the radio, she exhaled and pressed the trigger. The Barrett thundered once and the guard folded silently into the sand. The others moved instantly, shadows against the dawn. She watched them through the scope. Tight formation, precise, efficient. The commander led them through the wreckage, his movements fluid, almost ghost-like. She tracked them, adjusting for every corner, every potential angle of threat. Then something flickered at the edge of her vision. A glint, a flash. Her instinct screamed, "Contact North Ridge!" She shouted, but it was too late. The ground near the commander erupted in fire and sound. The blast threw them all to the ground. Through the dust and chaos, she could see him crawling toward cover, dragging the injured man. Her pulse spiked, but her breathing didn't change. She reloaded, sighted the ridge, and found the shooter. 1 shot, 2, silence. She switched channels. "Commander, status, static." Then his voice, strained but alive. "We're good. Move to secondary position." They were waiting. "Always are," she muttered, scanning for more movement. The world inside the scope was chaos made measurable. She saw 3 more shadows emerging from the far tent. Armed, deliberate. Her finger tightened. 1 breath, 1 heartbeat, 1 less shadow. By the time the last man fell, her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the precision that always came at a cost. She spoke into the comm again. "Compound clear. Copy. Moving to extract." Minutes later, she saw the commander reappear, the missing soldier slung over his shoulder. His sleeve was torn, blood dark against the fabric, but he was still moving. She exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. When the helicopter returned, the world seemed to expand again. Sound returned. Time returned. But she didn't feel it. She felt nothing. The ride back was quiet. The rescued soldier lay on a stretcher between them, unconscious but breathing. The commander sat opposite her, head tilted back against the wall, eyes half closed. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "You saved him." She shook her head slightly. "I delayed something else's turn." He opened his eyes. "You ever let yourself believe it's enough?" "Belief doesn't change the math." He didn't answer. They both stared out the small window as the desert passed beneath them like an old wound refusing to heal. Back at the base, medics rushed to meet them. Orders, voices, movement, everything loud again. She stepped aside, the Barrett still slung over her shoulder. The commander caught her wrist gently. "You did good." She looked down at his hand, then at him. "Good doesn't bring them back." He released her. "No, but it keeps us going." That night, she sat outside the barracks. The desert was cold again, the stars painfully bright. She opened her notebook, flipping past the pages filled with fragments and thoughts. She stopped on a blank one and wrote slowly. Some distances are measured in meters, others in memories. The second kind always hurts more. She closed the book and looked up at the stars, her breath visible in the chill. The wind moved softly through the camp, carrying faint whispers of engines and dreams. Somewhere behind her, the commander's voice broke the quiet. The base hospital smelled of iron, antiseptic, and silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel like confession. She stood in the hallway, motionless, watching the light flicker over the floor. The rescued soldier had survived the night. The commander hadn't spoken since the debrief. His arm was in a sling now, his voice roughened by exhaustion and morphine. She hadn't gone to see him yet. Outside, the wind was rising again, dust crawling along the runway like a restless memory. She walked out into it, needing space that didn't echo with screams she hadn't made. The Barrett was locked in the armory for the first time in weeks, and without it, she felt unbalanced, like a ghost missing its anchor. She reached the edge of the airfield, where the earth met the endless horizon. The sun was sinking, bleeding gold into gray. She watched it without thinking, without wanting anything except stillness. A voice behind her broke the moment. "You keep standing there like that, someone might think you're waiting for something." The commander's voice, quiet, rough, alive. She turned slightly, not surprised to see him despite the hospital orders. His face was pale, eyes darker than before. "Maybe I am," she said. "For what?" "For the world to stop spinning long enough to make sense." He walked up beside her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Good luck with that." They stood together in silence, the wind tugging at their sleeves. For a while, it felt like the war had paused again, like the whole desert was listening. "You haven't been in the armory today?" he said finally. "I don't clean what isn't dirty." He gave a small nod. "You think that rifle keeps you human, don't you?" She looked at him. "It keeps me from forgetting." "Same thing sometimes," he said. She didn't answer. The light was fading, shadows stretching long and thin across the tarmac. In the distance, a transport helicopter lifted into the air, its blades slicing through dusk. For a moment, the wind carried the sound of it across the field, low and mournful, like a heart that didn't know how to stop. They started walking back toward the barracks. The commander limped slightly, his movements slower, but he refused help. "You heard about the next rotation?" he asked. She nodded. "Mountain region. Cold, high visibility near zero? You volunteering?" "I don't volunteer." "I obey." He gave her a look, half concern, half resignation. "You ever think about not obeying?" She didn't hesitate. "Every day." "Then I remember what happens when I do." He didn't ask what she meant. Some truths were too sharp to touch. Later that night, she lay awake in her bunk, eyes tracing the cracks on the ceiling. The camp was silent except for the occasional thud of boots outside, the hum of generators, and the distant metallic cry of wind through wire. Her hand rested on her notebook, but she didn't open it. Words felt too heavy. She thought about the man they'd rescued. She had seen him once before, laughing in the mess hall, head tilted back, alive. Now he was quiet, eyes always fixed on the floor, like someone who had looked too long into darkness and brought some of it back with him. She knew that look too well. Sleep didn't come. When she finally rose, the barracks were dark. She dressed silently, slipped outside, and made her way to the armory. The key turned easily. The fluorescent light flickered once before stabilizing. The Barrett waited on the table where she had left it, disassembled, clean, patient. She sat down and began to reassemble it, piece by piece, the motions slow, deliberate. Each click and slide was a heartbeat, each breath a memory. When it was whole again, she rested her palms on the cold metal and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw Sangin again, the ridge, the shot, the silence. She heard the commander's voice calling her name through static, faint and distant. She saw the men she couldn't save, the faces that never left. When she opened her eyes, tears had formed but didn't fall. She wiped them with the back of her hand, almost angry at herself for remembering how. She whispered softly to the rifle, words that sounded more like prayer than madness. "You don't sleep either, do you?" The sound of the door opening broke her trance. The commander stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, eyes unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. He nodded toward the rifle. "You always come here when you can't." "It's quieter than my head." He stepped inside, the room filling with the scent of dust and gun oil. "You know, people think snipers love the distance, that it's about control or power." She looked up. "And what do you think it's about?" He hesitated. "Surrender. You give yourself to silence, to math, to wind. You let the world decide what happens after you breathe." She studied him for a long moment. "You sound like someone who's been behind glass too." He smiled faintly. "We all end up there eventually." They stood in silence, the hum of the light overhead their only witness. Finally, she said quietly, "He was calling for his mother before we reached him." The commander's expression softened. "The prisoner?" She nodded. He was barely conscious, kept saying her name like it would open the sky. He sat down beside her, lowering his injured arm onto the table. "You think anyone hears us when we call like that?" "I don't know," she said, "but I think silence does. It remembers everything we say to it." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something break behind his composure. A flicker of fear, of weariness. "You can't keep carrying it all," he said. "Even silence has weight." She turned back to the Barrett, tracing the barrel with her fingertip. "That's why I clean it. To remind myself that even steel can be scarred and still work." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not steel." "No," she said. "I'm the sound that comes before it breaks." The words hung in the air, sharp and fragile. He reached out, resting his good hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be." She looked at him, but her face didn't change. "It's too late for don't have to." He didn't answer. The hum of the light grew louder in the silence. When she finally stood, the Barrett gleamed under the fluorescent glow. She slung it over her shoulder and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" he asked. She paused. "Out. The stars don't talk, but they don't lie either." He watched her go, the sound of her boots fading down the corridor until only silence remained. Outside, the desert spread beneath a black sky dusted with white fire. She looked up and breathed deeply, the air cold against her skin. For a moment, she could almost pretend the stars were watching, keeping count, forgiving her. Almost. The letter arrived at dawn, folded, sealed, and unmarked. No insignia, no sender, just her name scrawled in a hand she almost recognized. It waited on her bunk like a ghost that had been sitting there all night. The air inside the barracks was still, heavy with the scent of metal and dust. She stared at it for a long time before touching it, half expecting it to dissolve under her fingers. When she finally opened it, the paper trembled slightly in her hands. The words were brief, clean, and deliberate. Military handwriting with a trace of something human. We've reviewed your file. Your record speaks for itself. Effective immediately, you are reassigned to Operation Eclipse. Classified coordinates. Departure within 48 hours. Command. At the bottom, a small note had been added in blue ink, not official. You don't have to say yes. She knew that handwriting. The commander's. She folded the letter once, then again, until it was small enough to disappear in her hand. For a moment, she just stood there, the world outside the barracks already bright with the kind of sun that never forgave shadows. She didn't say anything to the others. She went straight to the armory. The Barrett was waiting, quiet, gleaming faintly in the early light. She ran her fingers along the barrel, tracing the familiar imperfections, each one a scar she could name by sound, smell, and silence. The commander found her there an hour later. He didn't ask if she'd read it. He just leaned against the doorframe, his arm still bound in bandages, his face drawn but steady. They want you, he said softly. They always do, she replied. You don't have to go. She kept her gaze on the rifle. They don't ask. They summon. He walked closer, his boots echoing softly on the concrete. It's not just another mission. Eclipse is different. Deep recon, zero contact, no extraction guarantee. She looked up finally, her eyes pale and unflinching. That's why they chose me. He studied her face for a long time, searching for something. Fear, doubt, anything that might prove she was still breakable. He didn't find it. You know, you don't owe them eternity. Her voice was calm. I owe silence its completion, he frowned. And what does that even mean? She turned away, resting her hand on the rifle. You wouldn't understand. He almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. I understand too well. You think silence redeems you. It doesn't, it just hides you. She looked back at him, eyes steady. And where would you rather hide, Commander? In the noise? He said nothing. For a moment, the light shifted, cutting across her face, and he saw the exhaustion carved deep beneath her calm. She wasn't fearless. She was just too tired to be afraid anymore. That night, he found her sitting by the runway again, the same place she always went before every mission. The desert wind had turned cold, the stars sharp and bright. She was holding her notebook open on her lap, but not writing. The pages flickered in the breeze like wings trying to remember flight. He sat beside her without a word. For a while, they just listened, to the engines humming somewhere in the dark, to the faint rhythm of boots on gravel, to the vast, aching quiet of a world that didn't know how to end. Finally, she said, Do you ever think about before? Before what? Before we stopped being people. He took a long breath. I used to. Then I realized remembering hurts worse than forgetting. She nodded slowly. I don't remember the faces anymore. Just the sounds. The sound of breathing before a shot. The pause. The echo. He looked at her notebook. You ever write about it? No, I write to stop remembering. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. Then take this, he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a photograph, old and faded. A woman, her, standing in uniform, smiling slightly, sunlight in her hair. The photo was cracked at the edges, worn like something that had been carried too long. Where did you get this? She asked quietly. Intel Archive? They file everything. Even ghosts. She stared at the image for a long time. The girl in the picture looked like someone she might have met once, years ago. Someone who still believed that survival was proof of purpose. I used to think she'd come back, she said softly. She still could. She shook her head. No, she didn't make it out of the valley. He didn't argue. The truth was sitting right beside them. When the wind picked up again, she folded the photo and slipped it into her notebook. Why did you give it to me? So you remember you weren't born out of silence, he said. She smiled faintly. You think pictures save people? No. But sometimes they remind us we existed before the war started counting for us. She looked down at her hands. I wouldn't know what to do if I stopped counting. Maybe that's the point. They sat together until the first light of dawn crept across the sand. The engines of a waiting transport roared to life, dust spiraling into the air. She stood, the notebook tucked under her arm. Eclipse, he said, standing too. Once you're in, you can't call for extraction. You understand that? She nodded. Silence doesn't call for help. He reached out, his hand brushing her sleeve. Then let it go for once. She didn't pull away. But she didn't promise either. You know I can't. He watched her walk toward the transport, the rising sun catching the edge of her hair, turning it to gold. She didn't look back. Inside the aircraft, she took her seat by the window. The photo in her notebook burned in her mind like a mirror she didn't want to face. As the engines lifted them into the sky, she pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered something only the wind could hear. If the silence remembers me, let it tell the truth. Below, the desert receded into distance, the base shrinking to a blur, and the horizon opened wide, endless, merciless, waiting. The mountains rose from the horizon like frozen waves, sharp and pale against the bruised sky. Operation Eclipse began there, where light and sound died first. The air was thin, cold enough to steal breath, and the silence stretched wider than the desert ever had. It wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the absence of everything human. She moved with the precision of ritual. The Barrett rested across her back, the scope covered against frost, her breath visible in the air. The small team, 4 shadows, advanced through the valley, their boots sinking into snow instead of sand this time. Every sound felt amplified. The click of a safety, the rustle of fabric, the crunch beneath their feet. They were 6 days into the mission. No signals, no contact. Only coordinates and survival. Their target was an observation post built into the cliffs, an enemy stronghold that doubled as a listening station. Command wanted silence restored. The irony wasn't lost on her. At night, the campfire was forbidden. They slept beneath tarps, the cold gnawing through layers of cloth. The stars above looked sharper here, crueler. Each night she wrote by red light, her words barely visible on the page. Silence used to be refuge, now it's a witness. She closed the notebook before the ink froze. The commander had stayed behind on the base. She could still hear his voice sometimes, carried by memory more than distance. You don't owe silence eternity. She had wanted to believe that. But belief was warmth, and warmth didn't survive out here. On the 7th day, they reached the ridge. The outpost was barely visible below, a pattern of dark shapes buried in snow, faint lights flickering like dying stars. She crawled forward, unfolding the Barrett, aligning the bipod, her breath steady despite the altitude. The team leader whispered through the comms, voice thin and distorted. Targets confirmed. 2 guards on the roof, 1 near the entrance. Wait for the shift. She adjusted her scope, tracking the rhythm of their movement. Every step, every pause, predictable. Humans were predictable, even when they tried not to be. She watched the vapor of their breath dissolve in the cold. When the shift came, she exhaled slowly, aligning crosshairs with the first man's throat. The sound of the shot vanished into the wind, swallowed before it could echo. The second fell seconds later, no alarm. Only snow, gently disturbed. The team advanced down the slope, disappearing into the white. She stayed behind Overwatch. Always Overwatch. Her world existed between the blink and the trigger. Between life continuing and stopping, minutes stretched. Then she heard it, a faint sound, wrong and deliberate. The kind of silence that holds its breath. Her hand tightened on the rifle. Movement east, she whispered. Static answered her. Then the explosion came. Light tore through the snowfield, a wave of heat and thunder rolling up the mountain. The shock knocked her flat, snow biting her face. When she raised her head, the outpost below was burning. Her earpiece crackled, half voices breaking apart in static. She caught fragments, trap, fall back, 2 down. And then nothing. She pressed her eye to the scope. Through the smoke and fire, she saw figures running, shapes blurred by distance and flame. She adjusted focus, heart steady despite everything. There, one of her own, dragging another through the wreckage. She recognized the movement, the way he leaned to one side, the gait of the wounded. The commander's voice echoed in her mind. You can't keep carrying it all, she whispered under her breath. I'm not. The shot cracked once. The enemy figure dropped. Silence returned. By the time she reached the ruins, the snow was red and black. The remaining 2 soldiers were alive, one injured, one in shock. She didn't ask names. She didn't need them. They moved to higher ground before nightfall, setting up a small perimeter among the rocks. When the wind died, the world grew too still again. She sat apart from the others, cleaning the Barrett by starlight. The cloth was stiff from frost, her fingers numb, but her movements never faltered. Each motion was as steady as breathing. The injured man stirred nearby, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you leave us?" She looked up. "Because silence doesn't need more ghosts." He stared at her for a long moment before turning away. Later, when the others slept, she opened her notebook again. Her handwriting trembled, but the words came slow and certain. "When silence breaks, it doesn't shatter, it bleeds." She closed the notebook, tucking it inside her jacket near her heart, the cold bit deeper, sharp, and merciless. She thought of the base, of the commander, of the photograph he had given her. The image flickered in her mind like a distant campfire, her younger self smiling into sunlight that no longer existed. She whispered to the dark. She wouldn't have made it here. No voice answered. Only wind, weaving through the rocks like breath through broken lungs. The next morning, they began the descent. The mission was considered complete, target eliminated, silence restored. But she didn't feel the weight of victory. Only the familiar emptiness of precision well executed. Halfway down the ridge, she stopped. The sky was turning gold again, soft light spilling across the snow. She set the Barrett in the snow beside her, kneeling slowly. The reflection of the dawn shimmered on the rifle's barrel, bright enough to sting her eyes. For a moment, she let herself breathe without counting. Just breath. Just air. The others called her name, but she didn't answer. She reached into her jacket and took out the photo. The paper was worn, edges curled, the ink faded. She looked at the girl again. The smile, the sunlight, the innocence of someone who still believed purpose was a destination instead of a wound. She tore the photo in half. Then she let it fall into the snow. The wind took the pieces before they touched the ground. She whispered, "You can stop waiting now." When she rejoined the others, her face was calm again. The silence around her wasn't peace, it was armor. As the helicopter approached in the distance, its sound carried faintly across the mountains. She looked down at the Barrett one last time. The metal gleamed in the sun, and for a heartbeat she saw her reflection, a face made of distance and discipline. Then she looked away, because she knew the war wasn't behind her anymore. It was inside her, quiet and patient, waiting for the next order that sounded too much like destiny. The base felt different when she returned. It wasn't the place that had changed, it was her. The world had become quieter in ways that no one else could hear. Every sound seemed to echo longer, softer, like it was being swallowed before it reached her. The laughter from the mess hall sounded rehearsed, the clatter of boots too far away, the hum of the generators a heartbeat that didn't belong to her anymore. She walked across the tarmac alone, snow melting into dust beneath her boots. The helicopter blades behind her slowed to stillness, and for a moment the silence felt heavier than the noise. The Barrett was slung across her shoulder, its black surface reflecting the harsh midday light. It gleamed like something holy and condemned all at once. The commander stood waiting near the hangar. His face was leaner, his eyes older. He didn't smile when he saw her. He just nodded once, the way people do when words are too fragile for the truth. "You made it back," he said quietly. "For now," she replied. He motioned toward the armory. "Debrief in 20 minutes. They'll want every detail." She started walking beside him, but her steps were slower, like her body hadn't caught up to being home. "Details don't matter," she said. "Only outcomes." "Tell that to the ones writing the reports," he muttered. Inside the armory, the air was thick with the smell of oil and gunmetal. Everything was as she'd left it, except for the thin layer of dust that had settled in her absence. She laid the Barrett on the table carefully, the way some people lay down flowers on graves. The commander leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You lost weight." "I traded it for distance." "You sound like a ghost." She looked up. "Maybe I am," he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. There was something about her eyes, still pale. Endless. That told him she'd left parts of herself somewhere in the mountains and hadn't gone back to get them. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her something small, a folded piece of paper. You dropped this. She unfolded it slowly. It was the torn photograph. The one she'd let the wind take. But this one was only half, the part with her face missing. Just the sunlight and the faint outline of her hand. How? She whispered. Found it in my office, he said. They said it blew in through the open window during a storm. I figured it was yours. She stared at it for a long time. Maybe it wanted to come back. Or maybe you never really let it go. She placed it gently beside the rifle, as if afraid it might dissolve. I thought silence was clean, she said. But it's not. It collects everything you try to bury. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. Then stop burying it. I can't, she said. If I dig too deep, I disappear. The room fell quiet again. The hum of the light above flickered, a soft pulse that matched the rhythm of her thoughts. The debrief was short. She said what they wanted to hear. Mission complete, 0 extraction losses, target neutralized. She didn't mention the cold, the explosion, the eyes that wouldn't close. The officers nodded, wrote notes, signed papers. None of them looked at her long enough to notice she was unraveling quietly, thread by thread. That night, she went to the firing range. It was empty, lit only by the red glow of warning lights. She set the Barrett on the bench, loaded it, and aimed downrange. The targets blurred. The air smelled of metal and ozone. She didn't pull the trigger. She just watched through the scope, breathing slowly. Each heartbeat echoed through the barrel. The silence was deafening. Then, a voice behind her. You're not there anymore, are you? The commander. She didn't turn. I don't know where I am, she said. He walked closer, stopping beside her. You survived, but you didn't return. I returned to the only thing that listens. He looked at the rifle, then at her. It's not listening. It's waiting. For what? For you to let it go. She lowered the rifle, setting it on the table. Her voice was a whisper. If I let it go, what's left? He met her eyes. You, she almost smiled, but it died before reaching her lips. I don't know who that is. He exhaled slowly. Then maybe it's time to find out. She turned away, picking up the shell casing that had been left from some previous shooter. It was small, light, harmless until it wasn't. The sound after a shot, she said. That's where I live now, he nodded. Then maybe that's where you start walking out from. The wind outside picked up, rattling the thin metal walls of the range. For a moment, they both stood there, listening to it. Finally, she said, You ever think silence has a heartbeat? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? Every time it stops, I wait for it to start again. But it doesn't. It just gets quieter. He didn't know how to answer. So he didn't. When she finally left, she didn't take the Barrett with her. She left it on the bench, the barrel catching the last flicker of light before darkness swallowed it. She walked through the base slowly, the night air cold against her skin. In her pocket, the half photo fluttered with her steps, soft as a pulse. Back in her quarters, she sat on the floor, her back against the wall. The notebook lay open beside her, but she didn't write. Words had stopped working. Instead, she took the photo and placed it between the pages, closing the book gently over it. She whispered to the silence. You can rest now, but she didn't believe it. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of an engine, and somewhere beyond the wire fences, the desert waited. Vast, patient, unfinished. The nights had grown longer on the base. Even the floodlights seemed tired, flickering in slow breaths that matched the exhaustion of those still awake. She had stopped marking time. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable like footprints erased by wind. She no longer slept inside. The air in her quarters felt too heavy, too full of echoes. Instead, she stayed on the outskirts of the base, near the perimeter wall where the desert began. The sand there hummed when the wind moved, a low vibration that reminded her of the pulse inside the Barrett when the trigger broke. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, the cold creeping up her arms until even shivering felt like a luxury. The commander had been watching her unravel quietly. He hadn't said much. He'd learned that language sometimes made her retreat further, but now her silence had begun to consume the rest of them. She wasn't part of the world anymore. She was orbiting it, lightless, invisible. That morning, he found her kneeling beside the wall, tracing lines in the sand with the tip of a spent casing. The sky above them was colorless, the kind of gray that could collapse into storm or light, depending on who was watching. You missed breakfast again, he said softly. I wasn't hungry. You haven't been for days. I've been feeding the quiet. He frowned. You talk like the silence is alive. She looked up, her eyes distant but steady. It is. It just needs someone to keep it breathing. He crouched beside her, his injured arm still stiff. You're not its keeper. Maybe it's mine. The wind shifted, lifting strands of her hair across her face. For a moment, she looked almost peaceful, and that frightened him more than the emptiness. I spoke with command, he said finally. They want to ground you. Evaluation, mandatory leave, psych review. Her hand stopped moving. They think silence is a sickness. They think you're disappearing. She smiled faintly. Maybe that's all surviving really is. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You can't keep doing this. The missions, the solitude. You're burning out. Fire doesn't burn out, she said. It just changes shape. He stood, pacing a few steps away before turning back. Do you even want to live anymore? The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. She didn't answer at first. The horizon behind her was vast and empty, a reflection of her own pause. Finally, she said, I'm still here, aren't I? That's not the same thing. She rose, brushing sand from her knees. Maybe not, but it's what I have left. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, the glow from a single lamp painting long shadows across the walls. Her file lay open on the desk, pages of missions, commendations, distances, confirmed kills. Every line was written in the language of precision, none in the language of pain. At the bottom of the last report, someone had typed exemplary performance under sustained psychological strain. He closed the folder slowly, feeling sick. He found her again near midnight, back in the armory. The Barrett was laid out before her, gleaming under the white light like a sacred object on an altar. She wasn't cleaning it. She was just sitting there, hands resting lightly on the metal, eyes distant. I thought you left this here for good, he said. I tried, she whispered. It came back. He moved closer. You can put it down again. I don't think it lets me. He sat beside her. It's not alive. She looked at him. Neither am I. The words hit him harder than he expected. He reached out, placing his hand over hers. Her skin was cold, pulse faint but steady. You're wrong, he said. You're here. Right now. You're breathing, she met his gaze. Breathing is just the body's way of pretending it wants to stay. He wanted to shout, to break through the calm that frightened him more than any battlefield ever had. Instead, he said quietly, then let it pretend. Let it buy you one more morning? Her eyes softened for the first time in weeks. Why do you care? He hesitated, then said, because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a soldier. She blinked slowly, as if the words took time to reach her. That's dangerous. I know. She looked down at the Barrett. You shouldn't risk yourself for someone who's already gone. You're not gone, he said. You're just lost, and if I don't want to be found, then I'll stay lost with you for a while. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was tender, almost fragile. She let out a long breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For the first time since Sangin, her hands left the rifle. She pushed it slightly away, the metal scraping softly against the table. He watched, uncertain whether to speak. Then she whispered, every time I close my eyes, I hear the sound before the shot. Not after, before. Like the world is holding its breath, waiting for me to decide whether it keeps spinning. He reached across the table, covering her trembling fingers with his. Then don't pull it this time. She nodded slowly, tears glinting at the edge of her lashes but refusing to fall. You think silence forgives? I think it remembers, he said, and maybe remembering is enough. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second a tiny act of defiance against the stillness surrounding them. She stood, the movement slow but certain. Tomorrow, she said. I'll try tomorrow, he nodded. That's all I ask. When she left, he stayed behind, staring at the rifle. It lay there motionless, its barrel reflecting the light like a horizon made of glass. For a brief, irrational moment, he thought he could hear it breathing. Outside, she walked to the edge of the base, where the floodlights ended and the desert began. The sky was clear, the stars infinite. She tilted her head back and whispered to them the words she hadn't said aloud in years. I want to live. The wind answered softly, carrying the sound away, scattering it over the sand until it was nothing more than a vibration, a pulse, a possibility. The desert waited exactly where she had left it. Months, maybe years, could have passed. Time had no authority out here. The wind traced old paths through the dunes, erasing every footprint that had ever tried to prove existence. And still the place breathed, low, steady, endless, like something that refused to die even when everyone else had. She returned alone. No orders this time, no radio, no mission. Just the letter of transfer she never signed and the need to stand where it had all begun. The commander hadn't stopped her. He only said, "If you go, promise you'll come back for yourself this time." She had nodded, but promises meant little when silence was listening. The ridge of Sangan rose ahead, familiar and terrible. The ground still held the memory of fire, the faint glitter of shrapnel half buried in sand. She knelt where the shot had happened, 247 meters from the valley floor, and for the first time she let herself look without the scope. The world was wide again, too wide, and the absence of glass between her and the horizon made her dizzy. The Barrett rested beside her, its metal dulled by travel. She opened the bolt, emptied the chamber, and laid the rifle flat on the ground. For years she had carried it like a spine. Now it looked like a mirror that had forgotten how to reflect. She took out her notebook. The pages were warped, the ink faded in places where tears she never admitted had fallen. On the last written line were the words, "Tomorrow I'll try tomorrow." Beneath it, she began to write again. "You called it a record. I called it distance, but it was neither. It was a doorway I never walked back through." Her hand trembled as she closed the book. The silence around her was thick, almost sentient. Every gust of wind sounded like breath, every grain of sand like a whisper of the ones she'd lost. She whispered into it, "I know you're still here." No answer. Just the slow exhale of the valley. She remembered their names then, not as a list, not as numbers in a report, but as fragments of sound. Laughter after rain, the scrape of boots on metal, the way one of them always hummed before dawn. For years, she had forced those memories down, thinking it was mercy. Now she realized it was burial. Her knees sank deeper into the sand. She pressed her palms to the earth until her fingers ached. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out raw, untrained, foreign. "I made the world stop for you. I thought that was mercy, too." The wind shifted suddenly, cold and fierce. It tore through her hair, rattled the rifle, lifted dust into the air. She closed her eyes against it, and in that darkness she saw them. Not ghosts, not visions, just movement. The memory of men alive again for one impossible second. One turned toward her, face half shadow, half light. And in his eyes she saw forgiveness that hurt more than blame. When she opened her eyes, the world was still. The wind had died. The valley waited. Nothing miraculous had happened, and yet everything had. She reached for the Barrett but didn't lift it. Instead, she began dismantling it slowly, methodically, the way she had done 1,000 times before, except now she wasn't cleaning. She was ending. Each piece came apart with a quiet click until it was just fragments of metal and memory. She dug into the sand with her hands and buried them one by one. The barrel, the bolt, the scope last of all. When she finished, only the empty case remained. She placed it on top of the mound and whispered, "You can rest now." The sun was lowering, turning the sky the color of fire through smoke. She stood, brushing sand from her palms, and looked east. For the first time, she didn't see the battlefield. She saw the edge of a beginning. The trek back to the base took hours. Darkness fell, and with it came a strange calm. Each step felt lighter, each breath less borrowed. She didn't count the distance. She let the desert count for her. The commander was waiting near the gate when she returned, a silhouette against the floodlights. He saw her before she spoke. "You went back," he said quietly. "I had to." He looked at her hands, empty, raw, trembling. "The rifle? Gone." He nodded slowly. "And you?" She met his eyes. "Still here." Something in his expression softened, like he'd been holding his breath for months and could finally let it out. "You look different. Lighter?" "Real," she gave a faint smile. "I buried the noise." He stepped closer, searching her face. "Did it work?" "For now." They walked together along the fence line. The desert behind them was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer frightened her. The stars were brighter tonight, or maybe she was just finally looking up. He said, "You know, I used to think silence was the absence of sound. And now? Now I think it's the presence of everything we're finally strong enough to hear." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Then maybe I'm ready to listen. They stopped near the hangar where the first light of dawn began to touch the metal walls. He turned to her. What happens now? She thought for a moment. I start learning what to do with both hands when they're not holding a weapon. He smiled. Small, tired, real. And if you forget? Then you'll remind me. He nodded once. Always. The sky was bleeding gold again, same as every morning, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like repetition. It felt like return. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her notebook. The last page was blank. She wrote slowly, the ink thick and deliberate. Today, I remembered the sound after the shot. It wasn't silence. It was life trying again. She closed the book, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the rising sun. The world after war did not come with instructions. It simply arrived, quietly, without ceremony, without warning, like dawn spilling into a room that had forgotten light existed. For the first time in years, she woke to the sound of her own breathing and not to orders echoing through static. The base had become a skeleton of routine. Planes still landed, soldiers still shouted, metal still clanged. But to her, it all sounded distant, as though someone had turned down the volume of existence. She moved through it like someone relearning gravity. Every step felt unfamiliar, every gesture a negotiation between memory and possibility. She didn't carry the Barrett anymore. The space on her shoulder where the strap used to cut into her skin felt strangely naked, almost weightless. She touched it sometimes, instinctively, the way people touch scars, not for pain, but for proof. The commander noticed the change before anyone else. He found her near the airstrip one morning, standing with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, watching a maintenance crew repair the wing of a transport plane. She looked peaceful, though her eyes were somewhere far beyond the horizon. You look like you're watching something that isn't there, he said softly. Maybe I am. What do you see? The future, she said. It's quiet. I don't trust it yet, he smiled faintly. You'll learn. They walked together for a while, the wind cutting across the field, carrying the smell of jet fuel and dust. The air felt cleaner now somehow, maybe because she was breathing for herself again. I've been thinking of leaving, she said suddenly. He looked at her, careful not to let surprise show. Leaving the base? Leaving this part of myself here. He nodded slowly. Where would you go? I don't know yet. Somewhere the silence doesn't sound like punishment. He took a deep breath, the kind that filled more than lungs. If you go, you'll find out who you were before all this. She shook her head gently. I don't think I want her back. I just want to meet who comes after. The wind picked up, scattering a swirl of sand between them. For a moment, neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. That night, she returned to the armory one last time. The room felt smaller without the Barrett's shadow stretching across the table. She sat at the same metal bench, tracing invisible lines in the dust with her finger. Her reflection looked back at her from the polished surface, softer, almost fragile. She spoke to it quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. You're still here. For the first time, she didn't sound disappointed. The commander found her there, his presence quieter now, like the sound of boots softened by familiarity. He carried a small wooden box. Something for you? He said. She looked at it but didn't reach out. What is it? He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside lay a compass, old, worn, edges scratched, the glass cracked but still reflecting light. It's been in my family for years, he said. Used to belong to a pilot who always said, even the lost need direction. She smiled faintly, tracing the compass with her eyes. Does it still point north? Not always, he admitted. Sometimes it points home instead. She closed the box carefully, like it might shatter if she breathed too hard. Thank you, he sat beside her. They'll keep trying to bring you back to the field, you know. They think people like us never really stop fighting. Maybe we don't, she said. We just change what we're fighting for. What will you fight for now? She thought for a long moment. Noise, laughter, small things that don't echo. He nodded. Then that's a good war to choose. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second soft, deliberate. Time, for once, didn't feel like an enemy. When she stood, she left the compass box in her jacket pocket, its weight comforting but not binding. She looked around the room one last time. The empty racks, the faint scent of oil, the ghost of her own rituals still clinging to the air. "I used to think cleaning the rifle was about control," she said. "But it was never about that. It was about finding something I could make whole again." He looked at her. "And now? Now I know some things don't need fixing. They just need releasing." Outside, the first rain in months had started to fall, soft, uncertain drops that turned the dust to clay. She stepped into it, eyes closed, face tilted upward. The water streaked down her cheeks, cool and alive. The commander stood at the doorway watching her. She looked weightless, like a silhouette carved out of the storm. She whispered to the rain, "It's not mercy I wanted." It was sound. When she turned back to him, she was smiling. Small, unsteady, real. "You were right," she said. "The silence was hiding me." He nodded, voice barely audible over the rainfall. "And now? Now it's just quiet." She walked past him, toward the far end of the base where the desert began. The mud clung to her boots, the rain to her hair. She didn't look back. That night, the commander sat at his desk, staring at her empty file. He reached for his pen and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. "Status: alive." He paused, then added another line beneath it. "Reassigned to the world." Outside, the rain kept falling, steady, cleansing, relentless. Dawn rose slow and deliberate, as though the sky itself was reluctant to open its eyes. The air smelled of wet earth and metal, the perfume of endings and beginnings mingling in one breath. The storm from the night before had washed the desert clean. Puddles caught the sunrise like fragments of shattered glass turning to gold. She stood at the edge of the runway with a single duffel bag, boots damp, jacket unzipped, compass tucked safely in her pocket. The helicopter waiting for her wasn't military green this time. It was gray, unmarked, humming quietly like something respectful of farewells. The commander approached from behind. His uniform looked less formal, more human. He carried nothing except an envelope. "You didn't say where you're going," he said. She turned, her expression calm. "Maybe because I don't know." He nodded slowly. "That's allowed now." A faint smile ghosted across her face. "It still feels strange." Freedom always does. They stood there, silent for a while, the kind of silence that no longer hurt. He handed her the envelope. "Your final clearance." "And a letter." She raised an eyebrow. "From you?" He hesitated. "From both of us." She opened it, eyes scanning the short lines. The top was official, and signatures, seals, the language of closure. But the note beneath it was written in his hand. "If you ever forget the sound of peace, find it in the quiet between your steps." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her jacket beside the compass. "You always did know how to write without saying too much." "It's the only way you'd listen," he said with a small smile. She stepped closer, studying him for a long moment. "You were the only voice that never turned into an order." He looked away, eyes tracing the horizon. "That's because you were never really mine to command." The rotor blades began to turn, sending waves of wind across the tarmac. Dust rose, swirling around them like ghosts reluctant to leave. She said quietly, "Do you believe in second lives?" He thought about it. "I believe in people who survive long enough to invent them." She nodded. "Then maybe this is mine." The sound grew louder, drowning the edges of their words. She took a step toward the helicopter, then paused. "If you ever come looking for me," he cut her off gently. "I'll follow the silence." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Then you'll find me everywhere." She turned and walked toward the aircraft. The light caught the edges of her hair, the reflection of the rising sun painting her in gold. She climbed aboard without looking back. Some goodbyes only hold their weight when carried in silence. As the helicopter lifted, the commander raised a hand, not in salute, but in promise. She saw it through the window, a small gesture lost quickly in distance. The sky widened. The world below blurred into color and memory. She looked down only once, the base, the runways, the hangars, then forward again, where the clouds opened like a new map. The pilot said something over the headset, but she barely heard. Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers closing around the compass. It vibrated faintly in her palm, the needle trembling, uncertain but alive. It didn't point north. It pointed home, though she didn't yet know where that was. She rested her head against the window, watching sunlight break over the mountains. For the first time, she didn't think of targets, of distances, of silence. She thought of sound, The small human sounds she had forgotten how to love. Rain against tin roofs, footsteps in hallways, laughter that didn't have to hide. She took out her notebook, flipped to the last page, and wrote slowly. To whoever finds this, know that the distance was never about killing. It was about coming home from it. I used to believe silence protected me. Now I know it was only waiting for me to speak again. She closed the notebook, placed it beside her, and let her eyes drift shut. The helicopter climbed higher. The desert faded into haze, the horizon into memory. The commander watched from the ground until the sound was gone. He stood there long after the dust settled, the empty air around him ringing with something that wasn't silence anymore. He walked back toward the barracks, passing the armory. Through the small window, he saw the bench where she used to sit. Dust had already begun to gather on the metal surface, soft and undisturbed. On the wall above, the faint outline of her shadow remained, light remembered by habit. He reached out and touched the cold metal, whispering to no one, "You did it." Outside, the wind carried his words away, scattering them into the same endless expanse that had once swallowed gunfire and ghosts. And for the first time in years, when the silence answered back, it sounded like peace.